Welcome everybody to our fourth session of the symposium today. For those of you that just tune in, this is basically a concluding symposium of a very long ongoing initiative already that started at the end of April and then beginning of May with a series of webinars related to the pandemic, which was initiated by Luisa Bravo, who's here with us. She couldn't join in the morning for the first sessions. I think I mentioned her obviously already, and by myself at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and then together with a whole group of institutions and individuals, and also our team here. And so we are very happy that you joined for this session. And just to introduce Luisa, Luisa is at the moment in Bologna, where she is situated. She's founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Space, which was a very key partner in this initiative, and also president of City Space Architecture, an NGO very much related to public space culture. And she's also teaching in Florence and in different other places. But without further ado, maybe I just pass the word to Luisa, and she will basically guide through today's, through this session. Okay. Thank you very much, Luisa.
Thank you, Henrik, and welcome to all attendees. Welcome to our speakers for this very interesting session dedicated to innovative approaches and creative practices during this COVID-19 pandemic that is lasting much more than was expected when we started this initiative, actually. As Hendrik mentioned, we started in May, but actually we started the discussion regarding this initiative back in March with a group of international scholars affiliated to the journal or City Space Architecture. And we started to think about how to actually give a response in regard of public space during this pandemic, since we are all scholars very much into research and practice in public space. And so we decided to actually design this online initiative in order to continue the conversation on public space and somehow also lift the spirits while nobody was allowed actually to leave public space in different ways. I think in Italy we were the first ones to experience a full lockdown, and then other countries followed. Also in Australia recently, I'm following what's happening, and I'm also following other countries in Europe. Now we are experiencing a second lockdown. So we do not actually see now the end of this pandemic. Projections say that maybe end of next year, but who knows? So this pandemic is having a real huge impact on our everyday life and on our urban routines, especially in regard of public space, since there are many restrictions in place and many problems in terms of how to use public space now during the pandemic and also later. So when we started to design this initiative back in March, we decided to give a large space to this topic, innovative approaches and creative practices. Since the idea was to actually having contents related to reactions of people, artists, art curators and activists on how actually public space could be reinvented and reimagined during the pandemic while following restrictions, but still playing as human beings in the public domain, expressing our own desire and interest actually to be outside and to try to express ourselves. As you know, the full initiative is published on the website of the Journal of Public Space, so you can retrieve contents of our 4 previous webinars related to this topic. Recorded webinars are available on the YouTube channel of City Space Architecture in a dedicated playlist. So you can go back to what we previously discussed regarding this topic. And I'm glad that we have this 5th webinar dedicated to how people can creatively rethink a public space. We have an amazing panel of speakers today. I think it's good that we start by inviting our speakers to join the conversation. We try to invite speakers from different geographical locations, also to understand the differences between the impact of the pandemic on public life, but also the difference between reactions through creative activities, also in regard to culture on public space. So we have Kathleen Verstraete from East Asia, Arts Director of the British Council, Maggie McCormick and Fiona Hillary from Contemporary Art and Social Transformation, RMIT University in Australia, and Floor van Dietz-Ewen, sorry, my pronunciation is very bad, architect, researcher and city guide, public space detective from the Netherlands. So we are basically covering Europe, Asia and Australia with this first webinar session. And potentially we can continue this conversation also later, because as I said, the pandemic will stay with us for more months, but let's stay positive and let's think about how we can actually reimagine public space. So I'm now introducing our first speaker, Kathleen, from the British Council in East Asia, since she's currently based in Singapore and leading the work of the British Council in the arts and creative industries across 14 countries in East Asia. She has also enough experience also in Europe because she was collaborating previously with IETM and On the Move, which are 2 the main leading programs, European leading programs on creative industries. So Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Louisa. Thanks everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening in Australia and other places. Yeah, a year without public space, let's indeed hope it's not going to be a year. I think there's probably never so much talked about public space or space, but also the relationship, I think, between time and space and what it means. So I guess my presentation will be more rooted into the practice on the ground of the programs that we are involved in with the British Council. And for those who are not very clear what we do in the British Council, we connect the UK, for international cultural relations and educational opportunities, and we work in 100 countries internationally. And the areas of work are in education, society, and arts and English. But in the arts, we really focus about those connections between artists and policymakers and arts professionals through artistic collaborations and exchanges. We look at long-term programs in particular spaces such as craft, but also creative hubs, which I will talk about later. And then also responding to global challenges in relation to gender, inclusion, disability, and climate change. There's actually a big call open now for climate change collaborations. You have to have a look. So that means we work at the national level, but also at the city level, and getting, a lot of insight, I would say, across on the ground because of our heads of arts in all those places on what's happening. And we have been As an organization, we connect obviously via public space through the work we do in collaboration with festivals or through grants we give. We've been working, for example, in the Philippines around the Pasig River Art for Urban Change program that we supported with Metropolitan Manila Development Authority. And that was very much about creation of site-specific artworks on pumping stations found around the Pasig River. Or other programs like Playable City, where you look at technology and public space in different parts of the world with Watershed in the UK. So, but then indeed that COVID, has really changed a lot for us as an organization, but definitely for our partners on the ground. And we've actually been organizing a series of webinars ourselves, like everybody was doing, gathering the creative hubs that we have been engaging with in the last few years, in the way how they reacted to COVID, how they felt, they can work with each other or learn from each other, and what the future would be like for those creative hubs. You can put the next slides, actually. Thank you. If that works, yeah. So these creative hubs, just to situate it, because everybody might have a different idea of what a creative hub is really, they can range in different areas like maker spaces, independent art spaces, creative businesses, but there is a notion of that, being a convener and a connector and a networker between the artists and the art professionals and the communities. And that's why we see them actually as spaces for civic and artistic engagement. So we've been really connecting since 2014, in Africa, Europe, wider Europe and Asia, around those creative hubs, and really supporting them in terms of making their spaces more sustainable, looking at their own business models, skills development, linking networks locally, but also looking at how could we help those spaces and actually advocating for the importance of these kind of spaces in a city. And we did that through research, and insight around, for example, the social impact of creative hubs in the Philippines and in other places specifically in Southeast Asia. And that's why you see these hubs are providing a space, a literal space, a platform for artists. They also, are a central marketplace for exposures and opportunities. And they look at how they connect with communities and look at quality of life enhancement. I mean, that was specifically kind of looked at through the research that we did in the Philippines. So that peer-to-peer networking has really been, how do we connect those people, in Southeast Asia with the UK? And when you look at what they're actually doing, it's really about this community engagement and incubation of new ideas. And what we then also see is the differences in different countries, because in COVID, I would say that Philippines has probably had the longest lockdown everywhere. Versus then other places in Thailand, it hasn't actually been so strong. So it's a very diverse context that we work in, and people are learning from each other. What's also interesting is this notion of community and how they build up the social space rather than a physical space. And that's what we say, the hubs can be often virtual, they can be physical. So they can actually, exist in very different formats or, ways. You do the next one, please. So it's about really, they navigate this hybridity and they linking in issues with cities, and they really reflect also, and that's why I wanted to look at the notion of public space, because public space is not a given in many countries. There is very few public space, it's very occupied public space, it's often not very safe public space. And those hubs are connecting with it, but they see themselves also as a place of where they bring the public in the space and look at how they are actually acting almost as a public space. So, and that's quite interesting, particularly, in COVID, but also how do they bring those communities then partially online, or how did they, work through COVID with particular communities, that needed the support, and how did they make a change in those places? So I would say that the notion of that public space is perhaps different than maybe in other parts of the world. It just depends on how you really want to define what the public space really is. If you do the next one. So the idea of, maybe you can click on it's a short video actually, that we have made, yeah, on the work in specifically in Malaysia. So they connect with issues, you know, urban regeneration, building networks, quality of life.
This is where you live. Lots of people, lots of ideas. But where can they come together? Creative hubs. So, what are creative hubs? Creative hubs bring communities of people together to share spaces, ideas, and resources. They could be places where you learn new skills with tools and technology, or where artists come together to share their work with audiences and each other. There are different kinds of creative hubs, and they come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them only exist online, but they all have some things in common. They help us to build networks and connections, create support for careers and businesses, and lead to benefits for the local economy. Most importantly, they can support people's well-being through community experiences and empower groups by sharing information and resources. Creative hubs contribute a lot to our society, but they need support too, because they are often run independently with limited funds. So why not get involved? Find out more about creative hubs near you and find your community. Let's connect and support creative hubs in Malaysia together.
Yeah, as mentioned, actually, these creative hubs are actually quite precarious. You know, they are independent. Lots of the people who are, you know, working there are doing multiple jobs. But I think it's about the way how they engage with the communities and how they engage with that different sense of public space, because the hub space is really seen as a public space because they are open to the public. Often it's just 24 hours non-stop open. And in many places, it's kind of more hangout places, you know, like many places in overall in the cities. And that's, you know, the arts, the managers of those spaces, the hub leaders, they are looking at how they can basically activate those spaces. Obviously, it went, you know, a lot working on online and doing that, you know, bringing basically the community they have in an online space during COVID. But if you look at how, for example, the next slide in Thailand, you know, spaces like that would be the Social Impact Cafe, where they have been working on, prior to COVID, it was a gathering space, a restaurant, the vocational training, and they work with at-risk youth training and workshop for urban refugees. So the space as such has always been viewed public, and passers-by, you know, would come in and they would use the space. So that's been obviously very challenging for them, but it's important to see what has been demonstrated through COVID is actually how important those spaces are. You know, often it's when something is absent that you start actually seeing the value of what they are bringing in a city. Another example is, the next one is a case study here in Manila. And it's called Collaboratory. It's an artist-run space in Manila. And that's where the community and the network, the library, the kitchen, the shop, it's almost like a family, you know, living together. And it's the same kind of sense that you would find also in Indonesia and in other places. It's kind of this hangout, this tambayan culture. So it's about replacing that online, obviously, is rather, you know, it was rather difficult. But what these places have been doing is actually, you know, going out and finding ideas. So for example, the PH, you know, 2098B, has been actually looking at the economic recovery, and they set up online markets for people. So they looked at what happens offline when people meet, how can they replicate it online? And they set up an online market for local creative businesses to find, you know, footing and gain roots to weather the difficult times as a creative community. So it's kind of looking at how can their platform be of use in times when the people who would normally do that themselves can't use that. If you go to the next one, that was another question we asked to the hubs, is then how do they actually connect through public space? Many of them are looking at public space as a borrowed space, because space is not so easy to find and it's short term, and they look at communal spaces, you know, shared spaces. Hubs, you know, move between those spaces and they activate communities where there is necessity. So in that sense, these places are almost mobile public spaces. And they serve different objectives. If you look at the next slide, there is, for example, Good School in English, an initiative of 3 arts collectives in Indonesia, the Ruang Rupa, Serum, and Grafis Huru Hara. And they see their space as a learning space, a living school where people can use the space and create new connections and learn and experiment, basically. So giving them a room to fail, but it's open completely to, you know, to the public. And again, that hangout culture is actually part of that. They also looked at how they support the community in, you know, through different types of money coming from one side, and how do they move it to other places to support, you know, the community in terms of services, knowledge, and artworks. And they, through those kind of exchanges, they're able to, well, create extra value for the community. So pre-COVID, Good School hired those spaces out as studios and to create offline events. And they organized all these bazaars and merchandises. So they see the space as a public space where people can come and interact with the members, and it's 24 hours open. So it's been challenging for them then to connect, but a lot of people have been, next slide, looking at how under lockdown, you know, they have been working. And what we saw, you know, doing our research by Onto spaces in Southeast Asia, that's the enormous solidarity that you see. And that's, you know, the collective care about what's happening in the communities. So what they started was, you know, setting up relief programs, the development of community gardens, and then revising space, you know, helping actually the community to develop new ways of complying with the health protocol. So actually, as artists, moving completely into the social space and seeing, you know, their role changing. They were also looking at how they can survive themselves. So if they had a particular asset, let's say a car or a van, they would start using that to produce things and to bring around, you know, in the community. So they've been doing, a lot of people have been doing visioning exercises, you know, of the future of the hub and how they connect with the larger community. And they've been really evaluating how their roles can change and how they can do things differently with communities beyond, you know, digital exhibitions or things online. And that's where I think, you know, the Borneo Lab, which is the next slide, really started to look at that in a very focused way. Borneo Lab is in Malaysia. And what they did is they invited, you know, talented and creative designers in Borneo, and they created a program of 30 days. And what they did is actually using unused outdoor spaces to better observe the social distancing of the work they wanted to do, and then to extend the interactions that they had from their space into the, you know, the outside of their physical hub. So you would say it was possible in lockdown to go out. So they said, well, people can't go in, we have to go out. So that meant that they have gained interest and much more profile actually by going out from the city. And they saw an increased inquiries in the type of work they do. So through the lockdown, interestingly, they actually were able to get more exposure for the work they are doing and to get much more attention for the role of arts or the role of artists in these kind of situations. So they did this, next slide, they did this project, a placemaking project, which we have been supporting as the British Council also, which were interactive and immersive installations and artworks. And they were, you know, exploring kind of the public relations model. So they, what they did is actually, you know, developing a process of transiting a new space and in the new normal, what they call it, the post-COVID. And they see that their roles as a hub is actually evolving with the community through those challenges that are coming. So they are also changing their operating model, and they're really, you know, an enabler now of more impactful community projects. So they see the necessity and the urgency of their space in the bigger context. And I think that's quite interesting how the arts has responded to that. So what they did, for example, was setting up a, next slide, a very simple idea, but it's actually what we all need, a sign of hope, which was a lasting installation that really invited the members of the public to participate in spreading hopeful messages and stories. So what they did is to collect them, you know, basically it was on the spot there, and they found really profound questions on what was arising around COVID-19. And then they basically looked at, you know, connecting that to social media. They also did that through the Public Wish Tree project, which is more connecting the online and the offline and creating a public space where people really can reflect on what their wishes for the future would be. And that was also done. So they you know, they look at how they go into the literal physical public space, but how they use the internet as a space too, to connect with, you know, with the communities. And next slide. You can, next, even. Yeah, and then the last example is perhaps more around, you know, Creative Dundee. And again, a hub is for us not necessarily a physical space. This is a digital creative hub. And I think what's again interesting here is how Dundee, you know, did the We Dundee project, because that sense of community, which is actually often not possible to do into the physical public space. They took that online, and they were really able to gather, you know, very insightful feedback from their communities. And then the fact that people could read up on that and could have this kind of open source, this space where everybody can understand what everybody is thinking, created somehow much more connections than might have happened in a physical public space. So it's, next slide and the last slide. So it's interesting actually how we reflect on a public space and what it really means, and how the blended space, you know, between the public, the physical public space and the digital public space has really been explored more, but that it's also related to a cultural context, I think, and that it's also really important who activates a space. You know, the public space can be there, but can actually be a dead public space. In which way is it activated? What's the role of artists within that? And that's where we see that hubs are uniquely placed to be those activators. And because they are so connected to communities, they understand, they're the feelers of the community, and they would react to that in very creative and artistic ways. So it's been for hubs a very interesting journey, you know, about their evolving role, an opportunity to become more socially engaged and to bring arts also closer to the people. So the future of public space, of course, is very, very challenging, because even on the online public space is not a given, particularly in a context, I would say, where free artistic expression, freedom of artistic expression is not a given, you know, and where hubs want to continue to do what they want to do, which is really connecting communities in the best possible way, be it face-to-face or online. So it's been an interesting time, and things are changing in Asia. Singapore is already fairly fine. I hope obviously that in other parts of the world, you know, it's moving towards that direction very soon, and that the role of public space, and particularly the role of arts in public space, you know, can regain their importance in different ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very rich presentation regarding projects and initiatives in Asia. And I see that people are at the core of these initiatives that you just described. It's very interesting actually to see that the British Council is giving opportunities to creative people to express themselves and encourage human interaction between artists and common people. Because this is actually, I think, the key of the message for those who are trying to promote public space culture. Thank you very much, Caitlin, because that was very actually inspiring for many that are trying to develop these programs and initiatives on public space in these difficult times. Because what we actually would like to do through this webinar and previous ones is to actually learn from others and inspire others. So I think this is very helpful. Thank you again.
Thank you.
So we move now to Australia, and we have Maggie McCormick and Fiona Hillary. They are both affiliated to CAST, Contemporary Art and Social Transformation Research Group based at RMIT University in Melbourne. Maggie and Fiona are also practicing artists and curators. They also write and research on art in public space. RMIT has this unique program of art in public space, and we are collaborating with the Journal of Public Space on a special series named Art and Activism in Public Space. We publish an issue every year in November. We already published 2 issues, and we are currently working on the 3rd issue that we hope to publish by the end of this month. So Maggie and Fiona, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll start. Just a moment, I'll just go to this, I think. In this year without public space, I've reflected a lot on the missing streets beneath my feet and asked questions: when public space is lost, what does society lose? When we return to the new COVID normal public space, what will we have learned? And from our COVID experience, how might we now rethink public space? Ironically, the virus has focused our view firmly on public space by creating reflective spaces facilitated by both windows and screens. On the one hand, we've looked out over the empty streets, and on the other hand, we've met through vastly increased digital public space. This digital public space, like the webinar we're engaged in now, has kept us connected as global citizens and connected through global issues such as the pandemic. But also it's created a platform to reimagine the new COVID normal and the urban future of public space. As one of the co-editors of Art and Activism in Public Space, the special issues of the Journal of Public Space, along with Louisa Bravo and Fiona Hillary, I want to draw your attention to the important role artistic practice plays in imagining, constructing and claiming public space, and in thinking about and building knowledge about public space. While the cultural sector has been hit hard by the impact of COVID-19, this is also a sector to look to for creative and innovative approaches to the act of rethinking. The art and activism in public space issues emphasise the importance of integrating theory and practice as equal research tools in creating a deeper level of understanding of public space. Public space artistic practice is an important addition to the views of urban planners and administrators, architects and engineers, designers and landscapers, in order to uncover the full meaning and value of public space. It's a complex and evolving concept, and to understand this from its practicalities to its poetics. Public space artistic practice sits close to everyday people who make the space their own. It reflects their unity and their conflicts. It highlights common social issues, and it stops us in our tracks by creating question marks in our shared spaces, and it makes us think and act. The upcoming 2020 issue of Art and Activism in Public Space did not set out to specifically address the impact of the pandemic on art, activism and public space. Rather, it serves as a global snapshot of site-specific experiences and societal issues played out across these richly diverse global public spaces as the shared learning space. What is highlighted are existing public space dilemmas brought into the spotlight through the COVID-19 experience. And I encourage you to read the 2020 issue when it's published later this year, as it's a positive reassertion of the immense value of public practice and public space. I want to zero in briefly on 4 of the contributors to this journal issue and how their practice contributes to public space dialogue, addressing some of these dilemmas. The artists have all studied in the Master of Arts, Art and Public Space program at RMIT University, Melbourne, Australia, which focuses on critical engagement with contemporary urban space and culture. Each one of these artists interprets activism and public space through the lens of their specific practice, experience and cultural heritage, from Japan to Colombia to Vietnam to Australia, to draw on and draw out social issues from the person to the political. Ryoko is an artist and current PhD candidate at RMIT University. She arrived in Australia from Japan in 2014 as a voluntary evacuee from the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Her public practice is a gentle activism that responds to that experience, which is shared by a Japanese diaspora, through the nurturing of resilience. She creates temporary, spatial, neural, public architectures that aim to foster resilience through an understanding of the holistic self. She does this by reinterpreting such practices as Ikebana philosophy to open up new possibilities for socially engaged practice that addresses collective traumas in the midst and aftermath of global crisis and the social changes necessary for collective survival. Oscar Perilla is an architect, artist, and professor of architecture in Bogota, Colombia. From these multiple perspectives, he challenges approaches to city planning and the understanding of public space that mainly oscillates between 2 opposing poles: the organised city, dominated by modern architecture and architects planned with a top-down approach, and the perceived chaos of a messy and disorganised city shaped with a bottom-up spirit. Together with his architecture students, he explores concepts of a third way, in between these 2 poles that breaks the dichotomy. Through project-based interventions, urban and public space design is viewed as a process to empower inhabitants to shape their own city bottom up, whilst maintaining a sense of order and composition through design structures top down. Tao is a visual artist, curator and teacher at RMIT University. Her public practice investigates the destructive power of words and language. She combines text and experimental textiles to produce performative and ephemeral public installations. Her experimental sites offer a gentle disruption to people's everyday routine as a space for critical reflection and conversation about the big public issues of discrimination and sexual violence against women, the environmental crisis, and the racial mistreatment against Asian Australian refugees and asylum seekers. Zan is an independent artist with a background in education, community work, and the visual arts. Zan describes her public practice as rogue, lone, carnivalesque protest that uses the public space of Melbourne City as its site. These playful guerrilla incursions into public space by fictional characters act as a reminder of the potential power and influence that individual citizens have in relation to spatial politics within the city, through disrupting, creating, and recovering public space. In conclusion, the creation of the COVID normal public space will be a process of rethinking, reclaiming, and reconstructing in response to pre-existing public issues that COVID-19 shone a light on. Public space practice, such as that undertaken by these artists and others, reinforces the important role that art activism can play in this process. Thank you.
Thanks, Louisa and Hendrik, for this opportunity to present in this forum again. Maggie and I put together a seminar earlier in this series. I come to you tonight from the land of the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I want to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. I also would like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So Maggie and I come to you tonight from the stolen land and waterways of Australia. I have a speculative dream for new ways of being in this COVID world. In my artistic research, I am thinking with and through notions of post-human publics and what that might mean for public space. I'm interested in how we shift away from public space as a mere backdrop for our lives. Using the term post-human here, I draw on Rosie Braidotti. Post-humanism ruptures through human exceptionalism, where we aspire to become a new, improved version of man, and instead proposes new ways of being as situated, embedded, embodied subjects, always in the process of becoming. Through my research, I seek out assemblages and interactions that inspire new ways of thinking and creating site-specific public works. Drawing heavily from Stacey Alimo's work, she's coined the term transcorporeality that suggests that humans are interconnected not only with one another, but also with the material interchanges between body, substance, and place. She invites us to think with and through the stuff of the world, rather than seeing ourselves as separate from the world. Post-human publics builds a deliberate interdisciplinary approach where artists, through relationships to public space, to each other, to non-human, and to a multiplicity of ways of knowing and being, tug at the fabric of life. Reconstituting what public is, revealing alternative stories of sight through relational practice that involves attuning to the human and non-human entanglements that occur in public space.
That's it. Keep going.
In February this year, as the news of COVID was breaking around the world, we had our last international academic visitor for some time, Rosie Braidotti. To coincide with her visit to Melbourne, I curated an experiment using the gallery as a laboratory, using post-human publics as our methodology. Using the notion of the laboratory allows us to think through interdisciplinary modes of practice. It allows us to consider the ecologies of public space and the interactions that co-constitute the multiple meanings of public space. Central to our focus for this project was a remediated industrial landscape in the western suburbs of Melbourne, the Cheetham wetlands. Through this project, I wanted to think with the stuff of the world. I invited philosopher and researcher Simone Bignell to write a provocative piece about the wetlands that would start the conversations with a post-human framing for the month-long laboratory. Simone's paper positioned the landscape as never separate to the Woiwurrung people. I invited artists I had been visiting the site with to show their thinking about the site, not finished works, more sketches, ideas that were drawn from repeated visits to the site. The works changed weekly to include other artists that were involved in the laboratories. Heather Hesterman created a germination lab for Indigenous plant species that were affected by our summer's bushfires. Each day, participants were asked to tend the seedlings. A series of guest facilitators navigated conversations about remediated landscapes. A park ranger, a bioscientist, an urban geographer, a landscape architect, a somatic artist, and a phenomenologist took us on a journey to explore different insights into stuff of the world. Each session left new marks of care in the space. Literal care continued for the Murnong daisy seedlings as the days passed. At the end of the month, the seedlings were distributed to people who came into the space to grow in their own environments, perhaps imbued with the thoughts that circulated in the space for the duration of the laboratory. The laboratory was an interdisciplinary event. It created its own space from which emerged the importance of time for taking care. A rupture in our daily academic and creative processes to meld with other ways of thinking and being, taking time to act in the world. Through relational practices, dialogue engaging with and through creative practices, considering human and non-human interactions, I'm interested in how we transform familiar spaces into generative spaces for thinking and acting in the world. Through COVID, particularly in Melbourne, Australia, where we have had many months of lockdown, artistic practices have turned to the virtual. I have been involved in multiple public forums like this across the world. Delivering the Master of Arts Art in Public Space here at RMIT became a completely online affair. I've watched as artists have transferred their practices into the virtual realm in a myriad of ways. Recently, I participated in a fabulous workshop with Australian artist Kat Jones, Medicament for Your Predicament. We made tinctures and had conversations about the healing capacity of everyday plants, reconnecting us to the outside world. We exchanged ideas as artists and audience members while making balms, poultices, and all kinds of treatments for our times. My speculative dream is that we as practitioners in the public realm reconsider our relationship to public space, not as something separate from us. I'm interested in how we transform public space into vibrant, co-constituted spaces of inclusion for human and non-human species. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie and Fiona. I really appreciate this overview of what will be part of the next issue of the Journal of Public Space, which is really very rich. As you pointed out, we have so many contributions from so many artists and activists. So this series is actually growing a lot, art and activism in public space, and it is one of the most successful and most interesting series that we are now currently developing at the Journal of Public Space. Also, the attention to the built environment in a more comprehensive and sensitive way with the post-human approach designed by Rosi Braidotti. I think we already discussed about having a special issue of the Journal of Public Space on this topic, which could be actually very interesting, and I hope that we can continue that conversation also through city space architecture and creative practices that hopefully will restart soon in presence, because, you know, the human condition of being together, as Fiona was explaining, by defining these interdisciplinary contexts where you can actually invite so many experts from so many different fields, is creating that cross-contamination and transdisciplinary knowledge that I believe it is at the basis of public space culture, research and practice. So thank you again. And we moved to the Netherlands, and we moved to Floor. That is an architect, researcher, and also urban designer, working on interior design, small-scale architecture, and public space. She has been awarded with projects like Pop-Up Bus Stop, and she's also the founding partner of the International We Love Public Space Festival. In March 2020, so during the pandemic, Flor started the Public Space Detective blog, a research project investigating common and uncommon phenomena in public space as a response to the world being in lockdown after COVID-19 struck. Flor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Louisa. Thank you, Louisa, and for inviting me. Welcome to my presentation called Public Space in Flux. And I will focus on creative practices and innovative approaches to the crisis in the Netherlands, and specifically in Rotterdam, the place where I live and work. And as you pointed out, I'm a founding partner of the We Love Public Space Festival. And the goal of the festival is to celebrate public space. It's a platform to share knowledge and experiences of city makers of all disciplines. And we want to address urgent topics in public space in an inspiring way and setting or location. And this has been happening in Zoho, an active city maker district in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And I should mention also that I work together for this festival with a designer, Basala, and an artist, Ron Blom. So the three disciplines that are, important for public space, that intervene in public space, are represented in the team that organizes the festival. And well, this is, for instance, a spoken word performance done during the festival. And this is one of the posters we put out to engage the public to come and visit the various presentations that take place in Zoho.
Flor, sorry, are you sharing your presentation?
I was.
No, we do not see your presentation.
You do not see. Oh, that's a pity then.
That's why I'm asking.
You should have told me earlier.
We're thinking it's just an introduction. So.
Yes, I see now what happened. Do you see it now?
Not yet. You need to push at the bottom share.
Yes, I did. And I share a desktop. Sorry about that. My mouse. We did rehearse, didn't we, Hendrik?
We did before. Yes.
We did rehearse.
Okay. Now it's coming. Now it's coming. Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. Well, small recap, introduction of the festival. I already told you this. So I'm the founding partner together with Bas Sala and Ron Blom. Well, this is, for instance, one of the performances, a spoken word performance by Inusa Gomez in 2018. One of the posters we put up in the city, and here we have well, some images of events that take place during the festival. It's not just short presentations, but also workshops and performances by artists. As Louisa mentioned, I'm since March also active as the public space detective. And well, my goal is to investigate common and uncommon phenomena in public space. Investigating publicness, you could say it. And the term public space detective was coined during a workshop I did in 2017 together with Ron Blom, with students architecture in front of the central station in Rotterdam, and we went to look for signs of public life or publicness. And we found that, for instance, that could be cigarette butts or pieces of chewing gum stuck to the pavement in certain spots. And we counted them, how many were there within 1 square meter, and interpreted them as a space or a location of special interest when you look to public life or publicness. So the blog Public Space Detective, on the blog I share my personal observations, not just about Corona, but also about other phenomena like camouflage in public space, strategies, how to camouflage objects, unwanted objects. And well, one of the first posts is how you can look at public space as an antidote during the Corona crisis. It seems ironically that public space, specifically public parks, were sealed off during the lockdown, as they offer an opportunity to engage with other people, to catch a breath of fresh air, and engage with other people in a safe and socially distant way. So, as the public space detective, I want to take you into Rotterdam, and this is what you see when you come by train. You arrive in Rotterdam and enter the big hall, and you're about to embark on a journey in Rotterdam. This is a famous quote by Erasmus, the human philosopher who was born and lived in Rotterdam, saying, "Space separates our bodies, but not our minds." And with this quote in mind, I want to take you along a few projects that were initiated during the crisis in response to the crisis in Rotterdam. There's one thing we can already establish, that art and activism in Rotterdam has quite a strong tradition, BC, before Corona already, with projects from, for instance, Jeanne van Heeswijk, an artist who works in, for instance, Rotterdam South. And she established the Free House Afrikaner wijk, which is, you could say, a hub, a creative hub, to engage with the community and to do, as she quotes, radicalize the local, emphasize and enlarge the local possibilities, and engage local people from the community surrounding this hub. Drawing on people, their capabilities and skills. And art is an important, how would you call it, means to achieve that. So this is a strong tradition, and so there were quite soon there were projects initiated and also executed during the Corona crisis. And one of them is Publieke Werken, public works, initiated by Joost Maaskant, Siebe Kokke and Rineke Kraai. And it drew upon the network of cultural publicity that is spread all over Rotterdam. And this is a network to put up posters of cultural events that take place in the city. But due to COVID, all these events were cancelled. So they decided to put out an open call for amateur and professional artists to send in a work. And they received nearly 500 works. These were balloted, but still, a large amount of works were presented and printed in an edition of one. And what is interesting about this, to me, is commercial publicity in the city, outdoor publicity. It draws on repetition. One poster printed in 1,000 copies and then spread over the city. So the message is repeatedly, brought to the public. And this is the other way around. This is one poster and then one copy and spread over the city, throughout the city, randomly. So as an artist and also as the artist had to go and look for where their poster was located. And this coincided also with their idea to do an opening night in the outdoor, in public space. And the opening night, I went to look for some people I knew, the posters of some people I knew, because the artists were present at the location where their poster was present. And the opening night was also accomplished by a mobile DJ set and food truck. And this traveled around, so it made it into a traveling vernissage or opening night. And this was a good way also to span the whole city. You could go from the north to the center to the south. And everywhere there were people celebrating these public works. This was quite a nice event. The next project I want to present to you is Pension Almonde in Rotterdam in the north. And Pension Almonde is a commons. It's a project started by City in the Making, Stad in de Maak. And they have for a short while, for a year and a half, have been given by the municipality a row of 15 houses which were about to be demolished to establish a commons. And Rotterdam is in the process of gentrification. There is a lot of building going on, but not particularly building for people that may not be able to afford houses like that, or simply don't want to live in houses like that. City nomads or dropouts. Simply people who want maybe to live in a different way or are looking for a place to live for a short while. And they put out, for instance, also a newspaper called The Stoker. And during Corona, they played an important role in this neighborhood in Rotterdam North, because, for instance, there was a community kitchen that cooked meals and that were brought, that were spread throughout the neighborhood. These buildings were occupied only for temporarily, for a short while, because they are about to be demolished. And they staged, to finish off this period of time, they staged an opera called the Slopera. And the Slopera, well, it's a pun. It combines the word slopen and opera. And slopen means to demolish. So it's the account of, they call the subtitle is called The Tragic of a Street to be Demolished. And it puts to the stage, well, you could say the story of Pension Allemonde and the street where it's located, working with both professional and amateur actors. They work together with a theater collective called Wunderbaum, with amateur actors from the street. And what is interesting, very interesting, because this was during lockdown, and they performed the opera in public space in front of the building, but also from the balconies. So this makes the facade, you could say, to an interface. And it was possible to do it. The public was seated in the street at an appropriate distance from each other, as you can see here. And you had to bring your own chair. The weather conditions were sometimes nice and sometimes not so nice, but that's the Netherlands. And well, as you can see, this is bring your own chair. It drew quite a crowd. And here you can see some images of the opera. For instance, at the lower, the image right is the ballet of the wrecking ball, the wrecking balls. So it was with humor, but with a message also. The next space I want to take you to is Growing Space Wielewaal, and it's located in Rotterdam South. And Rotterdam South has a special position within Rotterdam because the South is historically also, you could say, a different area from the North. There is more poverty, there are more people without a job. Living conditions are more difficult, and also Rotterdam, being the melting pot it is, with over 170 nationalities, it also these nationalities are also more concentrated there than in the north. And the Wielewaal is a temporary village established after World War II. Because there was a large, there was shortage of housing at that time. So it was a temporary village built quick and with very small, tiny houses, you could say, tiny houses avant la lettre. And it was built after the war and to house, well, to house people who really needed that. And as you can see at the lower right, it looks really quite idyllic, but as it was built quickly and with well, lower quality standards, it's now outdated and also at the nominee to be demolished. This is how it looks today. But this will happen. This demolishment will happen, but there was a lot of opposition because this neighborhood has, you know, there's a strong social cohesion within this neighborhood, and the involved artists, Camille Verschuren and Carmen José, they proposed the glass house to position a glass house in public space, which is like a well, showcase for artists, but also for community art. And every week they stage a different exhibition. They started off with the Correspondentie Club, inviting children for a workshop to write cards to people that were isolated at home and did not receive, you know, much attention, to write or draw cards, postcards, to send to these people. And these cards were exposed in the glass house. This is another project that draws on the, well, the reserves or the potential of the community. They put out a survey, what does home to you? Homa, Burgo, and Despina, Papa, Istudi. And the keywords they got back from this survey, they also displayed within the glass house. And each week there's also like an opening of the new exhibition. It's also a showcase for individual artists to do a performance or a project or an exhibition for 1 week, and then the next one moves in. Next project is not realized yet, and it's the result of an open call for specific social-spatial interventions to explore new forms of meeting and intimacy in public space, triggered by Corona. And the open call was put out by the Stimuleringsfonds Creatieve Industrie. It's the fund for stimulating the creative industry in the Netherlands. And it's a large fund, and they initiated this open call. This is not a simulation, and they got 33 responses, of which 10 were chosen. And I want to highlight one of these proposals, and it's called Stappenplan, op gepaste afstand nabij. You could translate it as step by step, nearby at an appropriate distance. A proposal of Esther van der Wiel and Michou Nanon de Bruin. And it focuses on the different routines that they observed evolving during the COVID crisis in the lockdown in public space. Activities that formerly were performed inside were now located to public space outside. For instance, sports, the yoga, but also in the Netherlands there was an increase of dogs being bought as an alibi to go outside and walk the dog, because this was one of the activities that was allowed during the intelligent lockdown that was imposed by the government. And well, a lot of rules and regulations also were posted. And their proposal draws upon these change routines that appeared in public space during the lockdown. And they want to cross these routines with routes that certain protagonists perform in public space. For instance, the dog owner or the jogger that takes a certain route in public space, and that crosses maybe the route of the volunteer that cleans up a litter from the street. And by imposing these two layers, you could say, at the crossovers or the crossings of these routine and routes, they want to design interventions to highlight these crossovers and engage people to have maybe planned or unplanned safe interaction and more interaction in public space. And well, what I find very interesting about this proposal, it's a form of action research. And you could say it's trying or researching the possibility of programming serendipity, which is of course a paradox because, well, in a society which is becoming increasingly predictable, and that's even enforced by Corona measures, you might want to increase the chance of serendipity of people that formally or do not meet or are not part of the same bubble are able or are well steered towards meeting, planned or unplanned. And this is one of the major roles of public space to me. And this project is now undergoing, it's triggered by Corona, but the outcome of this project could be valuable for post-COVID public space too. And this is when you impose these two layers, this is what you might get of all the different actors or protagonists meeting in different places and where maybe a planned or unplanned interaction could take place. Well, I come to my conclusion. There's a new role, I think, emerging for public space, and activists, artists, and designers play a very important role in it. And the results of what we see happening today could be valuable also for a post-COVID society and public space. Referring to the place we are, the Netherlands, Rotterdam, we are blessed with a good climate for art and activism due to funding opportunities, both local and national. I already mentioned the Stimuleringsfonds, but there are also in Rotterdam, you have the CBK Rotterdam, who funded all these projects that I have shown. And well, most of these projects will be featured at the next We Love Public Space Festival, which we will stage in September 2021 in Rotterdam. It will be physical and partly online, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Flor, for presenting these practice projects happening before Corona. I like that one, before Corona and after, during Corona. And someone from the audience asked, what about these projects after Corona? So I don't know if you want already to answer, because now we are ready, I think, to start the roundtable discussion and engaging all the speakers. And also attendees are welcome to send questions by using the Q&A button. So as we saw from our speakers, there are very different approaches that are also different because of the context and the conditions of public space. As Kathleen was saying, public space is not a given, and I really agree on that sentence statement, because even I mean, in Europe, public space is not a given for sure, and you have to reclaim and constantly redefine public space. So I'm glad that with these speakers, actually, we understood how actually public space can be lived, transformed, and highlighted or enriched with ideas, performances, practices, public engagement, and many other different actions, actually, especially during these Corona times. So maybe we should say before Corona, during Corona, and after Corona. So maybe Flora, you should actually expand that before in this in-between period, before and after. So I would like to ask to our speakers the first question. Since we have been reading during this period a lot of articles on websites and also international and local newspapers, a lot of questions regarding the use of public space and the future of public space. Many are asking, how do we will be living public space after Corona? This period is going to affect our way of feeling safe in the public domain and still willing to be together. So I think it's very important that we try to understand how we can actually reconcile the concept of publicness with the concept of togetherness. I don't know, it's a very difficult question. I'm not to give us full answer or a universal recipe, but if you could actually share with us some reflections. Do you think that publicness will change after Corona? Because we see that it is actually changing now during Corona. And do you think that this idea of togetherness will stay in place? Are we longing to be together now and maybe after?
Shall I answer first?
Yes, please.
Yes. Well, I do think it will have a lasting effect on public space, but it might be in a positive way, because this crisis highlights the potential. And what you could say is that I read an article with an interview with a Dutch professor in geriatrics, and he stated that the condition we are in before Corona, traveling all over the world, meeting people, thousands of people in public space, on festivals, is something maybe of the past. And he called it social promiscuity, and this will change. And maybe it will be more dispersed, but this also offers opportunities to establish new forms, new relationships, new types and forms of activating public space, but in a different way.
Anyone else?
I'd like to, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think one of the a lot of positive things have come out of this time. And one of them, I think, has been that we've discovered different aspects about public space. Like where we live here in Melbourne, we're allowed out into the public domain now, but there's all kinds of rules and regulations. But what's happened is that people have really discovered all the small little grass areas and the out of the way little bits of public space, and they're using them in much more creative ways than perhaps we did before, which is quite an interesting outcome. And how from this experience of everyday people, how in fact artists might start to engage with those things that are happening just naturally. So it's been a kind of positive, interesting new look at public space, I think, that's come out of it.
Yes, I agree, because also, well, what you see here in Rotterdam is that there used to be, big festivals staged in public space. For instance, there's a park nearby, the Voese Park, and there was a big festival, a DJ festival going on every year, and then the park was sealed off. I call it the festivalization of the city. And this is something that has also, negative effects on the use of public space, the accessibility for the neighborhood. And this is something that might be of the past. These big events taking place in public space, and which is maybe not really an issue. It's more dispersed, but maybe people will be more engaged.
I think we'll see a proliferation of guerrilla art practices and tactical urbanism. I think that will be it's already occurring in our windows of exercise. They've become very creative spaces in short periods of time. So things will emerge in a public space that you might not anticipate. And I think people are really thinking a lot around how they can engage creatively without permission, because the layers of permission now become so much greater and more difficult to navigate. So I'm all for guerrilla art. I think here we go. It's always had a life in our cities, but I think it will come to the fore more significantly.
I also think that the use of data, what we've seen here in Singapore, when you go somewhere, I don't know if it's in other countries the same, but you actually can check how many people there would be somewhere. Obviously it's more shopping malls and other places, but the idea of how we perceive public space with lots of people as not being the ideal public space, and how we, through data, can actually navigate that and see what kind of social promiscuity are we actually, what level are we able to deal with somehow. Data could help us perhaps on that. And also, like the example I gave on Creative Dundee, it's kind of interesting how they got data from people in Dundee, about what the future of their public space would look like, and how they started to get much more an insight of what people want from a public space. I mean, how would that have happened if COVID didn't happen? I think the appreciation of something that you are missing is going to change the way how we look at it, and the way how we engage with it, and perhaps appreciate it more, and have more a say in what's happening and reclaiming the public space, like you were saying on festivals, in which way have public spaces actually become private spaces in many ways,
Yes. Well, that's exactly the point. This park is sealed off for a week in order to stage this festival, and this is really, this raises a lot of questions, and also, opposition in the neighborhood. So this is, I think this is a good thing that maybe this festivalization of the city is something that is not so not so normal anymore.
Well, the democratization of this public space again, for the people.
Yes.
Who are the people and who decides what happens with spaces in the end,
Well, it brings in money for the municipality. That's why they allow it. But why? At a certain point, you start to wonder why.
Yeah. Also the question of re-greening public spaces, that has been also a discussion here in Singapore. I mean, COVID comes together with an economic, challenges. And interestingly, the government has actually given, you can go and pick up your seeds at a community center and start planting things. So you would say, oh, we can start doing guerrilla gardening. That's obviously not possible. But the idea of how do you really contribute to a public space? What can you take from a public space and what can you give to a public space? Because it's a common good. So how do we actually look at the common goods? And how does it create relation, like one of you were saying? It's a relational space. And how artists are obviously the best to do to connect to that. But it's how do we decide who is activating it?
I think in the media we've seen a lot about how the environment has benefited from a more local focus of on life. So exactly what you're following on what you're saying, Caitlin, and the proliferation of guerrilla gardening, the proliferation of little libraries. There are a whole range of things that are occurring more locally that people may have once travelled a lot further to participate in or be a part of. So it's quite, I think we'll know, I think with the environmental benefits of slowing down, it might open this opportunity for rewilding in our own communities.
It's interesting, you would say, what initiatives were taking place pre-COVID, BC, that were never thought of as a kind of interesting initiative. I remember when I was living in Brussels, there would be kind of festivals happening in somebody's living room. You would have a small festival in your living room that you organized with maybe 10 people or something. So it wasn't about the big festivals, it was about the small intimate spaces where people connect to. Now this might be in the micro communities of what you're saying, that this comes back. So in which way is this an opportunity contradictory for people to come closer at a moment that we actually had to take a distance, I think.
I think like what I was saying before, that people are looking at the public space in different ways and looking at different ways of doing things. And like you say, when there is some kind of disaster or catastrophe or large event that impacts on people, like I'm thinking back to a place like Berlin, and when all the kind of lot of rebuilding was going on, and the whole place in many ways was a whole building site, if you like, especially East Berlin, or what was. And many artists there went back into their own homes, their own spaces, their own kitchens, the kind of thing you're talking about, but brought the public into them, so they became public spaces. So it was the rethinking of what is a public space and how you might use it. And I'm sure we'll start to see both the use of the actual public space in different ways, but also interpreting how you might convert what is normally a private environment.
That's what we see with the creative hubs in Southeast Asia a lot. I mean, they are very, very community-based. But I think, you know, there was other examples too in Holland, right, around those creative hubs doing that, you know, that bringing the public and the private, and how does the private have more say in the public? So that's an interesting kind of dynamic relationship, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you for this first round, and I think now we can start answering to some of the questions that came from the audience. I think a part of the conversation we had with the speakers now already answered to some of the questions. One question is from Giulia Gualtieri. Under COVID-19 pressure, will the public space become a sort of a battle zone for citizens as the mobility alternatives continue to spread, bike sharing, scooters, etc., creating tensions among different users? I think I can already answer to this question. I see what's happening in Italy right now. Actually something that speakers already addressed, the privatization of public space. Since this crisis is an health crisis, but also economic crisis, the government local governments are giving opportunities to bar and restaurants to expand their space outside in the public space. So putting tables and chairs, they occupy actually the public space, and they have reduced fees related to this occupation. I mean, to give them the opportunity to actually run their business. And so this expansion of private commercial driven entities in the public domain is actually limiting the use and accessibility of public space for different users, also for mobility issues like bicycles, for example. And there were several protests in the city where I live, Bologna, regarding this, since, you know, giving opportunities to private business, then limiting the real publicness of streets and squares. I understand that, I mean, it's very complex for local governments to manage the situation, but this is what's happening. And of course, during the pandemic, but we can think about an impact also after the pandemic, because private businesses, maybe they will ask to continue to use the public domain for their private endeavors. So this is happening in Italy right now, and people are protesting, but it's not such a huge protest. So even the way people actually understand what public space is and who can actually use and access the public space. So how actually the private interest is now superimposing his role on the public sphere, influencing also policies and rules from the local governments. I think this is a really very important aspect that we should take into account. But let's see what's happening in Australia, in Asia, and the Netherlands.
Melbourne's been under, prior to COVID and during COVID, Melbourne's been under heavy construction. And so we've seen many of our public spaces occupied by corporate building ventures, and the extension of our underground railway system has meant a considerable amount of public space that would normally be available to the general public is not. And along with that comes opportunities for artists as well to be showing their work in a corporate kind of context, which is not an uncommon phenomena by any means, but it changes. Once upon a time, artists taking over a suite of billboards, for example, was quite a radical act, intervening in corporate and advertising kind of context. And now it's interesting because they're the processes that corporates are often replicating now, using that kind of guerrilla intervention, claiming it, and I guess marketing a city through it. Yeah. So it's a really interesting and contested site, and that's where I think guerrilla art practices will have to become more innovative and more vibrant to shift it up, to change it, and so that they're not replicated by a corporate interest. I'm not saying that corporate is bad, I'm saying it's an interesting phenomena that's occurred.
Yeah, yeah. The other interesting phenomenon relates to your parklet, Louisa, in that there are parking spaces all over Melbourne now that are being taken over to extend restaurants so that we can be outdoors. And this has got a good side to it, which means that it's enlivening the streets again, and that there's less car parking around going on. So it's not so dominated by cars, but of course it has, like you were saying, another side where whether it remains, which is essentially a private takeover, whether it will remain that for a long time, and what that will actually mean to the public domain and the places that we're able to just go without having to buy food or pay to sit down, sort of thing. So there are all these kind of double things going on at the moment with public space.
Yes. Well, same here in Rotterdam. The parklets and the pop-up terraces, you could say. But I think maybe Rotterdam is in a different special position because, well, maybe you know, but the center of Rotterdam was bombed in World War II, and it was reconstructed not according to the historical morphology, but according to modernist rules, giving way for access of transportation because it should be modern and it should be accessible by car. This was, you know, the 50s, give way to modernity and long live the car. And at this point in time, already before COVID also, the municipality, the city is thinking about how to diminish the presence of the car in the center of the city. And they are doing experiments with claiming public spaces temporarily. And I find one good thing about the shared mobility initiatives or companies, you could say, because they're companies, is that they could have a positive effect on the presence of the car in the cityscape. So I think it's too early to draw conclusions, but it's in shift, you could say, right here from the position I am in. And I think a lot of people tend, well, of course, also in Holland, the bike is omnipresent. And during lockdown, this was increased, and also the number of people walking has increased. So I'm sort of positive about a new balance between public and privatized. How would you say it? Yeah, belangen, interests in public space. Does this answer your question, Louisa?
Yes, this is answering to my question. Do you want to add something, Kathleen?
I was thinking, because public space has to do with, you know, in that sense of public open, you know, that physical public space has to do obviously with the climate you live in. And we live in a tropical climate, so don't often sit outside when it's 30 degrees. But yeah, I mean, there has been obviously that taken into consideration, and some of the private has been getting into the public space from commercial, you know, interests. But at the same time, I mean, looking at reading around, you know, how maybe in certain cities, certain policies didn't get through, you know, to get more public space or car-free, you know, centers of cities, which now would be considered, you know. So I think it's actually maybe accelerating, you know, some decision-making at city level where it wasn't possible half a year ago. So.
Well, yes, I do agree with this. Actually, we found the same conclusion in one or two of our previous webinars, that the pandemic is accelerating this process of giving back streets to people, and to design public space for people, and removing, for example, cars from city centers. We have been, I mean, talking as a public space activist, but also as a research scholar, we have been writing and researching for decades regarding this topic, following leading scholars and theories on this idea of designing cities for people. And now this pandemic is making this very clear. And from local governments, those who are in charge to make decisions, actually, this is becoming a strategy. But it is very important that the strategy is understood well. I mean, it's not just making some, let's say, interventions just to establish, for example, a specific idea that is related to a political power, because otherwise, I mean, we miss the opportunity to actually reclaim as people this public space. And I see here in the Q&A session section that we are receiving questions regarding places where public space is controlled, there is no freedom of public expression. How can we actually overcome this? Because if you design cities for people, then you should give the people the possibility to actually freely express themselves. And so I'm just making an example that I was discussing with the speakers before we started this webinar. With City Space Architecture, my nonprofit organization, we have created a parklet from the end of September. We stay in place till the end of November. And this parklet was especially designed to give space to the people. So we removed the 3 parking spots, so it's very small parklet, just in front of our office. And we then invited the community to use the space. And people didn't react as we were expecting. A lot of, you know, bad comments because actually people didn't really understand what this space was designed for. And yesterday we invited some street artists just to give some energy to the space. They made a very short performance, less than 30 minutes, with the music and the dance. And some people were, you know, happy to see some sounds, music, energy, you know, joyful engagement, but some others didn't, and actually someone called the police. And so when the police came, the performance was already over. But just to tell you that, I think people, common people, now more than ever should be able to understand what the public space can be for all of us, because I think, as many others also said before, that the public space can be our lifeline during this pandemic and even after that. So, it's important that we have the right way to address contents related to public space and how people are actually have the right to use public space. It's about also democracy, self-expression and civil rights, something that actually we repeated many times. But I understand that this is not equal to different places, locations and cultures. So I think the pandemic is giving us the opportunity to deliver this message in many different ways according to locations. So what do you think? Do you agree or not?
Louisa, that's a fabulous tale to tell. And in the comments, Vivian Hallett has commented on the protest about the Northcote Golf Course in Melbourne, in Victoria. And during COVID, it wasn't being used as a golf course, of course, because all facilities were closed, and we've been in lockdown for a long time. And some people may or may not have found their way through the fence of the golf course. And so as restrictions were lifting, people were finding their way into the golf course as a space to exercise, walk and catch up. So now there's a huge and very vibrant conversation happening in the city of Darebin about the repurposing of big lots of land in built-up environments and how the general public can have access to those. So that's probably a watch this space kind of discussion, as it's in full swing at the moment. But I think it shows us that there's so much contestation about how we access public spaces as individuals within a city, within a community.
But that's like the reverse. Before we're talking about public space being taken over by private entity. This is like a private space in a sense that now can be rethought as a public space, even though it's under, as you say, it's being contested. But I mean, the ideas are now there. Before that, I think probably no one thought about walking around a golf course when they weren't playing golf. So it's opening up new ways of thinking about space.
In Singapore, the national parks, which controls all the parks in Singapore, you know, have been actually working together with an NGO who basically sets up community gardens in national parks, which I think is an interesting thing. I don't know if that's happening a lot in other spaces. You know, in Singapore, that's quite new, I would say. But it's all about negotiating that public space, you know. I mean, it's not a given, as you were saying, Louisa, that those public spaces are, you know, where people can exercise their rights, because it's actually a space of negotiation, and it's you know, depends on who shouts the loudest or who has the political power, you know, to decide what's happening, as I saw in some of the comments. And then what are the ways to give voice to that, but are also ways to circumvent it. You know, you could say in places like Vietnam, for example, if you would have, I mean, in many places you can go to outdoor movies, right? You know, or indoor in cinemas, and any movies would be shown. You know, in Vietnam, that's not the case. So, you know, certain movies that are not able to be shown would be shown online, but then people would actually meet and discuss them through connecting on the social media, in particular cafes. You know, so you would get the social aspect of something that should be a public kind of experience in a public space or in a cinema. That happens through navigating, you know, the challenges of well, freedom of expression essentially, and freedom of access to what's, cultural rights essentially.
Yeah, I would like to comment on that too, specifically on Louisa. I think it's a process, and the fact that your neighbors called the police. I mean, it's a process of action and reaction, and if you continue, if you have to have a long breath and keep going on, but the process will eventually demonstrate your right to be there, and maybe also their right to maybe not be so happy about it, and maybe it will come to a dialogue. But this is maybe the way it should be. To enter this process of dialogue.
Yes, you are absolutely right. It takes a while, and of course it's much more difficult now during the pandemic. But yes, public space has always been a process, as you were saying. And as activists and scholars on this very challenging topic, actually we are learning every day from practice, because
Yes.
things sometimes just go the wrong way. And so it's failing your expectations. So you never know. You need also a good audience and prepared audience also to receive these contents and to receive this practice and to also receive those efforts in creating public space culture. Okay, so I think we can close this webinar. Thank you to the speakers for being with us today. As you know, this webinar has been recorded, so the recording will be available later on different websites, Journal of Public Space, the website of the Symposium, the YouTube channel of City Space Architecture. We will send also an email to inform about these outcomes, and feel free to write us if you have questions and if you are willing to continue the conversation regarding this very interesting and inspiring topic, innovative approaches and creative practices. I would like to thank also Hendrik Tiben from the School of Architecture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and the team, Stephanie Chong and Hing-Ven Chan. Thank you for organizing this. If you want to say something before we close, Hendrik or Stephanie?
Stephanie wanted to introduce the next session.
Yeah. Just really quickly to let you guys know that in less than an hour at 8 p.m. Hong Kong time, it will be the last session for us for today, and it will be on campus as public space in the age of pandemic. So it's the first time that we really look at school campus and how it can be transformed and utilized as public space and open up during pandemic and post-pandemic. We'll have our University Dean of Students from CUHK, Raymond Chan. Will have the Executive Director of Worldwide University Network, Woon, which is a great supporter, partner of this symposium as well, and actually partially actually funded our symposium and our program of the day. And also we'll have Jose from Mexico to talk a lot about online learning and how to progress in the future of education and technology. So that will be up in 15 minutes. So if you're interested, stay tuned. You can check out our website for the session if you want to register that. And we still have actually a full day of program tomorrow. So tomorrow, Hong Kong, Asian time. So tonight for Europe and others. So check out the website I just posted in the chat box. There you can find the few more sessions that we have, and you can sign up per individual sessions, and you'll receive the Zoom link immediately, and you can join us as you like. So that's all from my side.
Thank you. Thank you again, and see you soon.
Yeah.
See you
In a bit.
Bye.
Okay, or lunch. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.